Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 231. It's Process and Product with Andrew Schmidt. There is a paradox between performance and pedagogy. Are we teaching our ensembles to perform, or are we teaching them skills that lead them to become performers? Does this distinction even matter? Is it time for a paradigm shift? This week, I am thrilled to bring you a fascinating conversation with Dr. Andrew Schmidt, an accomplished music educator and researcher. Andrew's passion for music cognition and educational process takes us on a deep dive into the relationship between learning music performance, and cognitive development. Together, we unpack the challenges of conducting meaningful research in our field, the nuanced differences between instrumental and vocal instruction, and the power of teaching students the why behind the what in music education. Oftentimes, musical ensemble teachers feel the pressure to put the performance on the calendar and then put our heads down and sprint. So this episode is more than just about music. It's about helping students connect the dots, fostering executive function, and balancing the process of learning with the magic of performance. It's about teaching powerful knowledge in rehearsals and rethinking how we engage students with music. So tune in and have your thinking stimulated and challenged. And then I really do want to know what you think. There's all kinds of ways you can let me know. You can join the Facebook group called Choralosophers, where we discuss these episodes. You can also join the Substack and enroll there for free, choralosophy.substack.com. Attention event organizers. Ludus is here to take your events to the next level. Imagine a ticketing platform that's not just about tickets. Ludus offers marketing, fundraising, and even volunteer management, all in one place. It's time to streamline your event management process and impress your attendees. Join the Ludus family today and unlock endless possibilities for your events. Go to ludus.com/choralosophy and try it out now, free to you. And if you use that link, you'll get the marketing feature free to your customers as well. How much do you normally pay for professional development as an educator? Whatever that number is for you. Now imagine you could chip in here for $3 a month and make a real difference in my ability to continue doing this show into year 2025 and beyond. So you can go to patreon.com/choralosophy to sign up there for as little as $3 a month, or you can just upgrade your free Substack subscription to a paid Substack subscription. Either way, the money goes to the same place for the same purpose. The producers and inner circle at Patreon are Venture Studios, Brian Long, Angie Schilling, Danelle Eckert, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, and Steve and Kathy Kakacek. All right, everybody, I'm here with Andrew Schmidt. Andrew Schmidt is a fellow music educator, and I'm really excited to dive into a topic that he and I are both passionate about, which is ideas related to music education, but also music cognition, the way that music instruction impacts our brain, the various kind of, I guess you could say, hardware and software upgrades that we're able to help our students achieve when they learn music. So Andrew, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
All right. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you first? Where do you come from? What do you do every day?
Yeah, so I'm currently in Atlanta, Georgia, where I have just actually finished my PhD at Georgia State University. I also teach choral methods at Georgia State University, and I'm also on faculty at Kennesaw State University, where I teach music theory, and I also teach musical theater, which is a lot of fun. I'm originally from the St. Louis area. I joined choir late. I was in high school when I first joined choir, but sang a long time. Undergraduate education in choral music ed, by way of being an oboe performance major, which is neither here nor there. University of Washington for my master's in choral conducting. My first job was as a substitute teacher, which I think every educator should be at some point or another. And then I landed an elementary gig, and I taught elementary for a few years while pursuing my master's. Then I got a middle school, high school combined job that I did for a while. I taught high school again, and then I sort of moved a little bit towards a hybrid high school higher ed job. Stuck with high school for a little bit when I moved to Georgia. Then I did elementary again. And then because of the pandemic, I decided to get a PhD and have gone more in that direction, leaning towards higher ed.
That's very interesting. Okay, so we will forgive you the oboe playing.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so Andrew, you reached out to me through my website to propose an episode, and I was really struck by what you wrote, and so I'm interested for you to just tell the audience why you thought some of the stuff you've been learning about, nerding about, thinking about, lined up so interestingly with what I've been talking about related to music literacy in the brain. What's your angle?
Right. So I'll back up a little bit just by saying that my journey towards this idea came as an educator and a little bit of frustration in that when I would go to teach literacy sorts of things or notational sorts of things, I always ran into friction with what the students expected a choir rehearsal to be like and what I wanted it to be like. I was always stymied that they were going to AP physics afterwards, or they were going to a biology class, or honors lit, where they were going to do this critical thinking, but the idea of learning quarter note, eighth note, or half note, that sort of thing, was not something they were interested in. And so I sort of felt like there was a disconnect. I also sing professionally in various choirs and easily recognize that they're some of the most brilliant individuals that I come across. Mm-hmm. And thinking, well, if you've got to be a critical thinker to sing these professional choirs, how do you start developing those skills in high school? What I loved about being an elementary teacher is they don't know anything else about music. So you can kind of meet them at sort of that high rigor level. And so when I started my PhD, I wanted to investigate this phenomenon of what I was running into. Now, you can't discount that maybe I was just going about it the wrong way. And after listening to your podcast, I think that there's things that I totally could have done differently and better as far as teaching literacy. But when I started looking into the literature about musical learning and the effects of musical learning, I found that there was this big gap between instrumentalists and singers. And that, singing is great for a lot of things. So I don't want to discount all the wonderful things that singing in a choir can do as far as, heartbeat synchronization, lowering blood pressure, dopamine uptake, all those great things. One of the things, according to the research at least, that singing in an ensemble is not good for is making you smarter or doing better on a math test or on a reading test. And so the literature, at least it's out there, backs this up. Studies of thousands of students that see these gains in instrumentalists and not in singers. And so I'm thinking, well, but I know some really, really smart singers. It can't be the instrument. It has to be pedagogy. And I think that's where we intersect, is in your insistence upon sort of this rigorous approach to literacy.
Yeah, no,
My rigorous approach tends to be about the voice, about singing.
Right. Yeah, sure. And I think there's probably value in both approach in the rigorous approach to really all learning. Did you happen to catch my episode with Anita Collins?
Yes, absolutely. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and I think that's a good jumping off point essentially for this conversation, because that was exactly one of the things that I had asked her about. Of course, she's a world-renowned expert on this literature that's out there, and was that there aren't really studies that I can find that study when choir is taught like an instrumental pedagogy. If choir is taught similarly to, nobody's studied that. And so I think that's really what I'm interested in digging into. And of course, obviously, I know you've not, I don't know that that's your research necessarily, but what are your thoughts about that? Is that what you're seeing too when you look at this literature that's out there?
Absolutely. There is a paucity of literature related to singing interventions. Now, there is a growing body of research having to do with community choirs and community singing. And so they do find these health benefits, but they similarly don't find cognitive growth. Right. Or if they do, it's limited to things like speech and noise, or our ability to perceive sounds better when there's interference around us, or our ability to discriminate between errors and just hear more clearly. But as far as like rewiring or extending cognitive architecture, they don't find these things with community choirs. Now, I've had, due to my own research, the wonderful opportunity to talk to a couple of leading researchers that look into this. And they would agree with your sentiment that there is a lack of emphasis on what's actually happening when they do these studies. They'll say people engaged in a community choir setting, or they were involved in El Sistema's string program in LA, but they don't have, well, what did they do for 10 weeks? They did it for 10 weeks, but there's no, day one, they got their instruments and they put it together. And, so when I was doing my study, I tried very hard to be transparent about what it was that I was doing on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis.
Yeah, it's always a red flag with me looking at research where the entire premise of the research is one giant confounding variable, but the researcher doesn't seem to know that that's what they've done.
Right, and I think that, sort of what your guest Collins was talking about is that these people aren't looking at it as educators. They're looking at it to understand music and the brain, or the brain via music, not so much the education aspect. And so they kind of gloss that part over.
They're not interested in figuring out which pedagogies work best. That's not what they're studying. They're just studying like what little fireworks go off in the brain when music is happening. And of course, and I think that's a really important aspect of this too. And I'm not a researcher, so I'm too busy teaching actual human children to hook them up to MRIs. But I really feel like this is something that, as choral professionals and vocal instructors, I sometimes am dismayed that we're not beating down the doors of some institution demanding that they study this.
Right. Because how do we improve our practices without some sort of verifiable evidence or what have you that something works or doesn't work?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the things that we have on our list here to kind of discuss is executive function as an indicator of academic success, and for of course that's an indicator of success in almost all domains of life. I know that the way I teach choir, I'm heavily emphasizing the idea that the individual student, thinks in first person in my choir rehearsals. I will be very picky with their language when they say things like, it's a soprano raises her hand and says, "We're having trouble with this, measure 42." Like, okay, that's fine, but can you say that in the first person? I'm having trouble with this in measure 42, which just allows them to start thinking of their musical problem-solving skills as first person. Because if I'm having a problem with this, then I can try to fix it. And if the whole choir is 42 people saying, I can fix it, I can fix it, I can fix it, then the whole choir is going to get pretty darn good pretty fast. And to me, that is a real-world laboratory setting experiment for teaching kids to improve their executive functioning skills. Thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah. In executive function terms, so people that study executive function talk about it as a top-down process, meaning the brain sends the signal to whatever it's going to then happen, rather than a bottom-up where like you sniff and the signal goes to your brain. So it's a top-down thing. And so when you're asking them to do these I statements, you're sort of asking them to engage in a metacognitive or a higher perception of what's going on, which would be that top-down process.
Yeah. And it's I think my area or my reasoning there is essentially that if every singer says "we" all the time in terms of problem solving, then it always could be someone else's job to fix it. And if everyone thinks that, then oftentimes the problems don't ever get solved. And I like to explain to kids that this is not just a choir skill. This is a skill that you're going to learn in choir, but you're going to take that skill into, like you said in our notes here, the job success, relationship success. I love it as a metaphor for relationships too. We just got in a fight, honey. Well, I mean, I didn't do the thing I told you I would do. I'm sorry. Right?
Yeah.
Those are two very, very different approaches to a relationship as well. And it's that kind of belief that we're in control. And I think that's a very valuable thing that a really high functioning choir would teach about that. So what research do you know of that in this category? Is there anybody who studies this kind of thing too?
So you can really nerd out about executive function, and basically people are now starting to look at cold EFs and hot EFs. And so the traditional model that like music learning researchers and executive function look at is a three-part model. So you've got working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. Those are kind of your main three subcomponents of executive function. I can define those further if you would like me to. But the hot side would be like for inhibitory control, the cold side would be looking both ways before crossing the street. You're going to inhibit the desire to go across the road by first looking both ways. On the hot side, it would be a reward thing, a delayed reward. So you could tell a kid, I will give you 5 cents now so you can go buy whatever, or 25 cents for a piece of candy now, or you can wait 6 days and I'll give you $5 and you can go and buy however many pieces of candy. And so they'll measure that as a hot executive function version of inhibitory control. So the idea that executive function is an indicator of these things like academic success, marital harmony, job success, other sorts of public safety, that sort of thing has to do with this idea of working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control that can be potentially elevated or grown through musical practice and musical learning.
So, and is that, let's kind of drill in on that then. Is there specific research on how those executive functioning things you described are either impacted by music learning or are at least like methodologically, so to speak, taught in music classes?
So this is where the debate lies in executive function training through musical learning, is that the researchers will separate what they call near transfer and far transfer. So near transfer things would be like, I study music, therefore I've got good ears. I've got strong listening skills. I can discriminate better between pitches than somebody who hasn't done musical learning. Or perhaps my fine motor skills are more advanced because I play piano or the violin. That's a near transfer, something directly related to what you're doing. Far transfer is that executive function component by saying I'm practicing my scales in 13 keys. So my working memory of knowledge of key signatures and fingering, my cognitive flexibility, my ability to shift between the different keys as I go up and down. My inhibitory control as I say I'm going to move my fingers this way, or I'm going to start, the B flat scale starts on 4 and 2, whereas the C scale starts with my pinky and my thumb. Does that kind of training transfer to people being better at looking both ways across the street, or organizing their calendar, or writing a really good cover letter that synthesizes all of their work experience or personal experience to apply for a job? That's where the debate is, and that's where the study is do we see these far transfer effects?
How would you characterize the debate, so to speak? Like, are there sides? Are you a director new to the profession? Or are you a seasoned director who is in a new place? One of my favorite tips for generating interest in the program and to instill buy-in is to plan a trip. There are so many options. You can go to Orlando, you can go to Ireland, or you can perform in a parade or a theme park. You can even take the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York. Wherever you end up, not only will your current crew look forward to the trip, but younger students will count the days until it's their turn to go. If you have no idea where to start, connect with Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com.
There are sides, yeah. It's sort of fascinating. So this all really began, do you remember the Mozart effect?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was 2004. And the Mozart effect basically was saying that when you listen to Mozart prior to taking some sort of test, it increases your ability to do spatial reasoning, kind of flipping objects around in your mind. It's kind of been debunked more or less since then, but that's kind of what got this onto the scene. And people thought, well, musical learning could make you smarter. It could increase IQ. Well, IQ is pretty stable throughout someone's lifespan. It can adjust, maybe early in life, but it sort of becomes fixed after a while. Executive function is much more plastic, and it does tend to solidify a little bit as we get older, and then even decreases a little bit as we get older. But musical learning has been shown, especially at critical points like around age 6 and 7, to grow through musical learning. The flip side is that the studies haven't always been very good. And so in 2017, these two researchers, last name's Sala and the other one is Gobet, they put together these meta-analyses. So they're looking at all of these studies that have been happening before 2017, and they go through and they do all their statistical analysis, and they find, well, if you put into account that maybe there's a lot of white kids doing this that come from affluent families that have two parents with higher education degrees that get fed every morning before they go to school. If you take in what they call all these moderating factors, then we don't really see anything at all. And if you want to maybe see something, then you need to start running studies that account for these things. So since 2017, the researchers were like, okay, we still think that there's something here. There's something about musical learning and executive function. So we're going to create much more stringent study designs that take into account IQ. Do people do music because they have a higher IQ, and so therefore they're choosing this more rigorous, this harder thing to do, or is it the music itself that it lifts up the cognitive architecture of the brain or expands the cognitive architecture? Is it people whose parents are super advocates for music education? Does that make a difference? So you control for all these factors, and then you do the study, and we still start to see some of these results. To a smaller degree, but more so than doing homework, more so than, an after school sort of thing. They've even done comparison studies between athletics and visual arts, and music tends to come out on top of those things as well. Now, as I mentioned, for instrumentalists, not for singers.
Right. And I want to get into that in a second. I do want to kind of dive into that. Why do we think that is? But what before we get there though, I'm curious to see what you think in terms of why is it that these poor quality studies are so common in fields like ours, because it's not just music and it's not just music education research. It's really kind of across the spectrum of education research in general, where in order to really zero in on findings, you end up having to, I would argue, correct for certain types of, I don't know how to say this other than just to say correct for certain types of study errors that should be basic in research, which is to try to account for variables, for example. That's like pretty basic. But I see this all the time, and I think when people hear me say this, they probably think I'm criticizing higher ed or whatever, but that's not really my intent. I'm a huge nerd, and I subscribe to a variety of email lists where basically I'm getting emails 5 or 6 times a day of random music people's theses and PhD papers and all the kind of stuff. They show up in my email box. And what I notice is a pretty consistent pattern of, if there's a sample size, it's very small. And if there isn't a whole lot of discussion about these confounding variables. Do you have a sense of why that is?
Yeah, so doing work with human beings is difficult, especially in academic settings. So sort of the gold standard, at least in our sort of westernized paradigm of research, is the clinical trial, where you randomly select people from a population to come in to your laboratory, where you can control the environment down to the level of humidity in the room and the sound, and you interact with these strangers, and you can do it over a long period of time, perhaps, so that you can get a larger sample size to run your experiment. When we work in academia, we work with the people that are in front of us, and it's not random. We call them quasi-experimental designs. They're not fully experimental because you simply can't. You could do a musical intervention in a lab, but are those results valid to a real-world application? You could say, well, yeah, but none of us are teaching in a lab. We're teaching, in a school with this certain population. And so it becomes messier because there's just less that you can control. That doesn't excuse poor methodology. And I think, back in the early 2000s, people were excited to do this work. They thought the Mozart effect became super popular. The governor of Georgia spent millions of dollars buying Mozart CDs for every newborn baby in the state. Right? It was this global phenomenon. So I think that and I can't speak for all of those researchers, but I imagine there was an expectation, a desire to get this going. And, so maybe corners were cut.
Well, yeah, and I think you're sniffing at it exactly right, which is that sometimes the sexy result, the headline grabbing result, will trigger a bias within the researchers themselves sometimes, because any human would like to say that they discovered the next big thing.
Right.
And it can cause, and that's again not a criticism. That's just a human thing. I can't say that I wouldn't be victim to it too, if I was in that situation. Like, I could come up with this thing, and like you said, the governor of Georgia believes me, so it must be, it must be right, and that kind of thing. And so I think you're exactly right, and the way you describe it is an issue in really all of the social sciences. And I always say that education is a social science. We are a social science, and it's messy because you can't put humans in a lab and then expect them to behave the same way when they leave the lab. It's the whole thing about, like, even if just pointing a camera at somebody is going to change their behavior.
Right.
So you can't record them on video and then say you've studied their behavior, because what if the camera wasn't there? They would have done something different, right? And I think that's really important. And I think that my interest in this education research topic is essentially that sometimes I think when we get that sexy result in music education, or in education broadly, when we get that sexy result, we want to push it out there and say that it is true, like that it's a thing that is true. But if somebody comes along and tries to advocate for a pedagogy or a process that isn't, maybe that nobody has researched at all, well, then we flip to the other side of the coin and say, well, nobody's researched that. Well, in reality, we don't have good evidence that the other thing's true either. So I think my beef usually in this domain is the lack of humility that comes in education. So I'm going to get us a little bit off topic here, but not a whole lot, which is that when my school district, for example, decides to drop, $500,000 of taxpayer money on a curriculum design program that has almost no evidence behind it at all, and then tells the teachers, here's how you must teach. And so I think that's the lack of humility kind of stuff that I'm talking about. It's like, give me these ideas. That's fine. Tell me that there's ideas that you did a study about. That's wonderful. But don't tell me it's like true. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, and I would also add to that there's publication bias, in that if you do a study and you don't find positive results, or if you find sort of middling or unequivocal results, your chances of getting published are lower than if you find verifiably positive or statistically significant results. And that's it's a problem in all research, not just social sciences. But we see that in the research fields, this publication bias, or this lack of publishing things that found nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, again, I'm just going to use, you're using the academic language, which I appreciate. I'll use the vernacular language.
Yeah.
Finding nothing is not sexy. So you're not going to get that publication because it's not going to get clicks. However, it is valuable for us to know as educators. We studied X, Y, and Z pedagogies, and turned out we found no effect at all.
Yeah. And in this executive function and musical learning field, there is one research group who is actively fighting to publish stuff that refutes all of the evidence. So there is drama within this research aspect. And they just came out with their own meta-analysis in 2024, which basically ended with them saying, look, we should just study music for music's sake and stop even worrying about all of these other things, because by worrying about all these other things and focusing on all these other things, we're sort of undermining the advocacy of there's just something special about music and we should just study music. So let it go. Yeah. But the other side is, well, but we are curious about the brain, and we are curious about how learning affects the brain, and we are curious about how music's role in that. So we're going to keep doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course,
Understanding that there's, you know,
my response to that, it continues to be, sure, if you're talking to other people who already understand how amazing music is,
yeah,
then you can get away. If you're preaching to the choir, so to speak, then you can get away with just saying music's amazing. There's just something so special about it, and then the other person that already knows will wink and nod and say, "Yes, I agree. There is something special about music," because they've all experienced it. But if you're trying to explain it to an administrator or a
hmm
politician or something like that, you're going to need to bring data, and you're going to need to bring facts, and you're going to need to bring some sexy chart that shows that this music instruction is making their kids smarter and whatever, and that music educators could not like that, but that's the reality of the world we live in.
right, yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into the instrumental versus vocal. Why do you think that we don't see the same type of cognitive benefits in in vocal instruction as we do in instrumental instruction? What's your theory?
Yeah, so my take was pretty much the same as your previous guest, Collins, who talked about this connection between the kinesthetic, the hearing, and the visual, and that, you know, with singers, it's a hidden instrument. We can't really see what's going on. We have sympathetic resonance to sort of help us guide what we're doing. If you don't teach that literacy component, the visual is sort of there, but not really doing it. And so in the worst case scenario, academically, now this is fine depending on where and how and why you're singing, but in an academic setting, if it's just you could limit it to just the ear and go from there. And you're not engaging the other two parts. Whereas if you're going to learn to play the violin, or you're going to learn to play the piano or percussion in band, you are forced more or less to engage with all three of these components.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree too. I think one of the things that I very firmly believe is that vocal music instruction was passed over essentially by this research because it is so rare that vocal instruction engages all three of those, that triangle that you just mentioned, all of the time as the core aspect of its pedagogy. And since that's so rare, there would just be not very many kids to study. Thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's two other sort of confounding factors with this. One of my mentors at Georgia State, Patrick Freer, who's big into male adolescent voice, but he has some other things too, talks about the paradox between performance and pedagogy, in that the purpose of choral music education to prepare you for the performance, or is the purpose of choral music education to prepare you with the skills that leads you to performance? And there's a paradox and there's a tension between how we operate in our classrooms, whether it's on what's guiding us. We can also call that process versus product, right? We've talked about that in education as well. The second thing that I'll add as a confounding element is that oftentimes in our choral settings, I think that we don't teach students the internal logic behind what we're doing in the classroom. Choral conductors often, in my opinion, if I can just speak for myself, we often work as puppet masters. And we sort of string, by pulling different strings and telling them to do all sorts of things, puppet master them into a refined product, without, like I said, going through the internal logic about creating that independent musicianship, helping them understand the difference between an abstraction and a concept, and how to turn an abstraction into a concept so it becomes their own. They're lacking labels. They're lacking all sorts of internal logic. About the situation.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and that's a big part of my pedagogy as well. It's just sometimes it probably drives my colleagues crazy or whatever, but I stop rehearsals a lot. Because my kids typically rehearse and acquire the music, the notes and rhythms part of what we're doing pretty quickly because they're really good at reading. But I stop the rehearsal a lot to ask them things like, describe what's going on in your brain right now. Like, even if it's just turn and tell somebody in your section what working through that section of the music was like and what struggles you were having and what it felt like in your brain. Or if we did like a some kind of complicated solfege pattern thing where you do all these, lots of, every choir person knows these, but where you might sing a scale but take out certain scale degrees and replace it with a kinesthetic movement or something like that, and you watch their brains just go like and explode because they're thinking about so many different things. And then I'm really careful about making sure that they then have a chance to talk about what they just did and why they feel like it's working for them and why is it hard, but what do you think it's going to make you better at in the future, and in making them connect those dots for themselves. Is that kind of what you mean by like talking about the internal logic?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I would agree. I would also add, and I'll talk this maybe about this in notational literacy terms, since I know that that's a big emphasis of yours. Is that, let's say you're doing a sight reading exercise and they stumble, and I know that you've talked about having them identify themselves. Where did they stumble, and why did they stumble? And let's say that you're noticing that their perfect fifths are always out of tune. They're always missing a perfect fifth. Do we take the time to then label that and say, okay, it's not just do sol, because do sol is a representation. It's not the logic behind what's happening. What's happening here in musical terms is a perfect fifth.
I see.
Or when we're singing up a scale, it's a combination of whole steps and half steps. And in order for us to tune or to sing an interval correctly outside of the context of solfege, a logical piece behind that would be understanding the difference between a major second and a minor second.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good. And that makes sense. So it's kind of the theory behind the music. And I think, I know for me personally, as a practicing teacher, for the first 15 years of my career, I had 54-minute classes. I now have 44-minute classes, which means that I get to do less of that. In other words, for all of us, I guess that's my point, is that for every teacher, we are limited by the realities of what our school systems allow us to do with kids. And we have to, and it kind of goes back to what your point was earlier too, of weighing the performance versus the process. And of course, this is just my bias, but I would say that both are important and we shouldn't sacrifice one for the other ever.
I would agree. Yeah, I think
give the kids the most of each that they can get.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I would just add, or I would advocate that, and I'll talk about research again, that study after study would show that spending the time on the front end in the process stuff yields benefits on the performance end. And in Andrew's opinion, would say that we oftentimes sacrifice the front end for the performance.
Yes. Yes. And we do it because we want to pick songs that are fancier.
Yeah, we overprogram, and we also water things down for great intentions. There's a wonderful philosopher sociologist who calls this pedagogic populism. When you water down your pedagogy so that people who would perhaps otherwise not be able to participate can participate. So things like rehearsal tracks are a watering down or a pedagogic populism. You want to get more people involved. So, okay, we're going to do this piece of music, but I'll basically spoon feed you through a rehearsal track without you having to learn how to read music. And we do, again, opinion, and maybe I'll get some nasty comments on this, but I think that we've developed an entire choral culture of these pedagogically populist sort of things, these watering down isms in our classroom.
I totally agree.
That are entryways for people to feel successful, but don't actually teach anything.
Right, which would be, I guess, a decision that a teacher would make if they fall more on the side of, no, it's really the performance that matters. It's does my choir sound good on stage? That's what matters.
Are there 300 people in my program?
Yeah, right. And again, like I said, I'm a believer that there's a balance to be struck there. Do we want our choirs to sound great? Yes, of course, everybody does. Well, let me give you an example. One of the things that I do in my program is that in second semester we do through our state adjudication system, we have small ensembles. Lots of choirs around the world and country have those. What I try to do is from ninth grade up to 12th grade to wean them off completely from getting help from us as teachers at all on their small ensembles, to the point where the 11th and 12th graders in my chamber choir, my most advanced kids, don't get help at all. We help them pick songs. And once they've got their songs, you're on your own. And they get the time in rehearsal. We provide that time for them to be together. And I simply, for an hour on Monday nights, I just walk around to the 4 or 5 groups that are broken up into the thing, and I answer questions if they have any, give them suggestions if they're feeling stuck. But the end product is theirs. They created it themselves. They go to the event and they perform from memory. Now, if I were to micromanage them and give them every little phrasing marking myself and go through and tell them all the vowel problems that I'm hearing that they're not noticing because I'm a professional musician and they're not, and if I were to go like make them come in before school and after school like a lot of teachers do and really drill these small ensembles so that they get the perfect rating, I could do that and they would sound better. That is absolutely true. And I tell my kids this all the time. We could make you sound better, but that is not my goal. My goal is to teach you how to learn this stuff on your own. And if there's some rough edges, but it was done by yourself as 17-year-olds, I am way more proud of that than if I had just nitpicked everything. Thoughts?
Right, because they're demonstrating what they've learned, what they understand, what their grasp of this internal logic of the choral setting is, what the processes are, what the synthesis is of all the different elements that go into preparing a piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of getting us back to some of those distinctions between the instrumental classroom and the vocal classroom. In your view, what are some of the things that go on in, say, a band class or an orchestra class or a piano lesson that might lead to this cognitive growth pedagogically that we could borrow and implement in vocal classrooms?
Yes.
What are some things that stick out?
So the prevailing wisdom in the development of executive function, if we want to tie it back to that, because it's right now the in vogue indicator of this cognitive growth and learning or musical learning. So there's 3 parts to it. Whatever the intervention, that's the research speak, or whatever the pedagogy is, has to be novel, of self-interest, and rigorous. And not rigorous as in hard, but rigorous as in progressive. Like you can't learn to multiply if you don't know how to add. You can't divide if you don't know how to subtract. That kind of progressive rigor. And so in a choral setting, perhaps we can assume there's some self-motivation, some self-desire to be there, maybe depending on the age, not as much. Novelty is kind of hard in that everybody can sing, but not everybody can sing chorally right away, or not everybody can sing bel canto right away, or not everybody can sing gospel through a technical way right away. So there's a novelty part. And then the rigor is what we've just been talking about. How are we teaching in a way that displays the logic of what we're going about?
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the reasons that I was so in love with Sight Reading Factory as a product. And since it's been so long since I've been yapping at everyone in the choir world about doing Sight Reading Factory, people might forget that I actually started doing Sight Reading Factory many, many years before there was a Choralosophy podcast. In fact, I think I had to have been one of the first users because I heard about it and jumped on right when it came out, because in my early teaching life, I would literally have to make, are you even, I don't know how old you are, but do you remember like the projector screens where it was like a transparency projector?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So we're not too far apart then, because I imagine like a certain age teacher practicing right now would have no idea what we're talking about. So
Right.
We used to have, when I first started teaching, I used to have drawers and drawers and drawers full of those that I would take out when it was time to practice sight reading and put them up on the screen, and so that it would just be but the problem is those take time and money ahead of time before class starts to create them, And so if I don't have one that fits the kids that are in front of me, I just have to force them into it, so to speak. And but with Sight Reading Factory, to kind of go back to your point of that rigor because it's progressive, that was the
Hmm.
thing that I noticed right away is I could get a group of freshmen, for example, that maybe they're not able to do what last year's group of freshmen could do. So I can go throw away those transparencies and those textbooks and different things that are, exercise one is exercise one for every group of kids.
Hmm.
And so I could go, oh, well, this group of kids, they seem to already be able to do skips. So we can go to level two. That's great. Or this group of kids, they're struggling to match pitch. So we're going to go to rhythm only, and we're going to go to some one or two note exercises where they can figure out how to slide around. It's just so customizable. And that's actually what led me years later when I was doing the podcast to getting to the point where I was coming up with these ideas of grading kids based on just are you getting better at these concepts. And I
Hmm.
think for instrumental classrooms, they have these method books, right?
Absolutely. I was going to say the same thing.
Yep.
They've got, yep.
Go
And
ahead.
not that I'm an
Expand.
advocate, yeah. And not that I'm an advocate of a choral method book, but we can see that in the choral field, is there a method, or is everyone's method sort of, we teach how we were taught?
Hmm.
And so we pick up these watering downs because it worked for somebody.
Yeah.
Versus a method book where people could say, well, this is the seventh edition of this method book because we started it 45 years ago and it was good, but then the second edition improved upon it, the third edition improved upon that, and now we're in edition seven, and we've kind of started to figure some things out.
Yeah. Yeah. Now okay. So did you play in band when you were a kid? Oh yeah, you oboe. You did
Oboe.
oboe. Yeah, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now
I
it's
already made
relevant.
fun of you for that. Okay. So all right. So I'm going to float an idea because this is an idea that I'm just having for the first time. So if it's dumb, you
Yeah.
tell me. So in band, the method book as we were used to getting it, like it's pretty standard across the country. A lot of times there's method books that maybe thousands of bands are using.
Essential
And
elements. Yeah.
yes, yep, the essential elements ones. I remember those. And those in band and orchestra, those can be pretty uniformly useful across every band class because when every single band kid shows up for the first day in fourth grade or fifth grade or whatever, they are brand new to that instrument. And there are certain things that they're going to have to learn for the first time. And the teacher can pretty much predict with almost 100% accuracy this kid will not know how to do this already. But choir is not that way. Every kid arrives with a wide range of proficiency already with how they use their voice when they sing. And that's why
Hmm.
a method book per se wouldn't work the same way as ours. So then my bias is go use Sight Reading Factory because you can customize it to them. But do you see what I'm saying about why a method book is less ubiquitous for us?
Oh, absolutely. It's way trickier, way more complex, way more variables. Like you said, with what they come into the room possessing.
Mm-hmm.
But in my opinion, it does not change the need to teach the internal logic of what's happening
Yes.
within the setting, regardless of your predilection towards making a great vocal sound or your speed at which you can pick up that this line is G and from G to D is a fifth. Somebody in that room has to put the pieces together with you, has to
Mm-hmm.
display what is going on in this system, has to scaffold so that you're at one point and you're going to go to somewhere else and you're going to do it. You're not going to be puppet mastered into doing it. And so that I think that still then becomes our charge as music
Yeah.
educators.
Well, and in that same variability and that same flexibility is also sometimes the great temptation for a lot of choir directors to skip all those steps because I can get them to sound good without teaching them any of those things.
Yeah, but here's the rub is that one of the number one, and again, this is going back to research, one of the number one reasons that adults cite for either quitting or not participating is feeling like they don't have the skills to keep up with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Either the reading skills or the vocal skills. More adult singers tend to label themselves as amateurs, whereas they tend to use the term musician for their instrumental counterparts.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that is not a coincidence that if we're teaching the, if we're, well, let me put it this way. I don't think we can complain that people don't think we are a real class if we don't teach it like a real class.
Hmm. Yeah. So I like when I was growing up, one of the things that my parents did for daycare after school is they dropped us off at this place called Creative Clay, where you would go and you would pick out your pottery and you would buff the seams down, and then they would fire it and you would paint it, and then you would antique it and make it look all pretty, and then give it to your grandma as a present for whatever the occasion. And I did this for probably years after school. I know nothing about ceramics. I know nothing about color theory. I know nothing about firing, right? It was this sort of joyous event that I got to do that didn't teach me a whole lot except for like, oh, this color looks nice for the eyes, kind of thing. And I think in our worst case scenario, that's pedagogically what can happen in a choral setting.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right, and it also brings up the a reasonable devil's advocacy, so to speak. But I think it's also an important thing for us to clarify. Pretty much, this whole conversation is we are talking about music in an academic setting, where we
Hmm.
are teaching kids music as a class, as in assessment, a grade, feedback of how you're doing and progressing. Now, is there still value in people just singing just to sing?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I still have some of the little figurines that I painted. I'm still
Hmm.
really proud, and those are joyful memories of
Yeah.
mine. And I would go and pay money to go to one of those places again and paint a plate.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Right. And that doesn't mean, though, that you shouldn't be really kind of upset if you go sign up to pay money for an art class and you come out learning nothing more than you already do from sitting down and just painting your plate. Like you would
Right.
expect to be taught like how to do the thing. And so that I think so that's important because some people I often in my experience they people hear me talk about this kind of stuff and instantly say, well, but people sing in all kinds of ways all around the world and for lots of different things. Okay, sure, but this is a class. This is a
Yeah.
class, and you should still sing in your church and maybe not care about what a perfect fifth is. If that's not a thing that your church talks about, great. You should do that, and there's lots of reasons to do that. You should sing. People should sit around drum circles and sing "Kumbaya" out in the woods at camping trips, and they shouldn't talk about perfect fifths there either. Like there's all these contexts in which singing exists where we don't have to talk about that kind of stuff, and it's really okay if nobody knows about it. But in our domain as teachers and educators, that's where I make a kind of a switch in my mind. Thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite music education philosophers is Graham McPhail, who's out of New Zealand. And he just came out with a brand new philosophy book like 2 years ago. The first six chapters are like reading Harry Potter. They're super exciting. But he terms this powerful knowledge. And that the purpose of schooling is to teach this powerful knowledge. And basically, this is knowledge that cannot be found outside of schooling. People aren't going around in the world labeling perfect fifths. They're not going to access that kind of knowledge unless there's somebody to introduce them to it, or at least get them started in the
Yeah.
kind of thinking and the kind of understanding of the concept or of the field in which they can then go explore on their own. Whereas there's plenty of singing knowledge that can be found outside of school.
Yeah. Sounds like that's a guest I need to track down. That
Oh,
I
absolutely. I think he'd be a fantastic guest. Yeah.
Yeah, I need to track that down because I don't know that name. So I'm excited to add that to my list because that is actually the way. And I'm assuming you're kind of paraphrasing something he said when you
Yeah.
said that the purpose of schooling is to learn powerful knowledge that you can't find without school, which is
Right.
one of my passion points with my educational philosophy is, for example, we can take this very relatively modern in my lifetime, this idea of taking the concept of cultural relevance with music education and applying it to repertoire, which I think is a misunderstanding already of culturally relevant pedagogy, but that's a whole different podcast. And the misunderstanding is that what that means is you have to teach them songs they already know. And
Mm.
in order for them to care, in order for them to buy in. And I think really more what we should think about that concept, in my opinion, is that we might connect with them initially over songs that they know and enjoy simply by us being open to their musical tastes, so
Hmm.
that they will let us teach them stuff they don't know.
Yes, and so Graham McPhail, I don't want to, just in case you have him, I don't want to tell his whole
Oh
story,
no.
but in New Zealand, they don't have ensemble-based music, just
Hmm.
like in other countries, right? So it's a more general music-based thing, and there's been this influx of popular music in the curriculum, and so they're trying to reconcile this, or he's trying to reconcile what then the purpose of music education is if they can kind of learn all these vernacular popular things without school. And what he comes to is that you can take this music because it still has an internal logic. You can
Hmm.
still teach musical concepts through culturally relevant pedagogy if you want to go in that direction. A
Hmm.
spiritual, a gospel piece, a pop song, a musical theater thing, a jazz chart, all contain analogous connecting musical logic.
Hmm. Yeah.
And if we take the time to teach it, it almost doesn't matter the repertoire. This is both as far as theory, if you want to go into Western theory, and vocal pedagogy sort of
Hmm.
way. The vocal instrument is the vocal instrument. And learning how to sing in one style, learning how to sing in a lot of different styles is like cross training for
Right.
your voice. How I understand my voice so well because I'm equally proficient at singing Wicked as I am at singing O mio babbino caro.
Uh-huh.
And I
Yep.
understand how the
Yep.
voice works in that way.
And I would say in a music setting, almost only, I say almost carefully, but almost only in a school choral setting or a school vocal music instruction setting would a kid ever be taught to sing in five or six or seven different styles and languages over the course of a year.
No, no.
Yeah.
And I would caution against it, at least as far as like in trying to cover that in 1 year. I think that the development of a strong vocal pedagogy, just like the development of strong notational literacy skills, happens in elementary.
Oh, for sure. And I wouldn't probably
Yeah,
do that to beginners,
yeah,
but
yeah, absolutely.
I could probably cover that much ground with my seniors. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If
that kind
they,
of thing.
if,
It's scaffolding. It's building the rigor gradually, like we talked about before.
hmm
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, and understanding how the different components of the voice interact together to create different sounds.
Yeah.
But we come back as choral educators to these watered down things that muddle, that sort of muddy the internal logic.
Hmm.
The sing from the diaphragm,
Right.
right? That's
Yeah.
that's that's a trope that tells us nothing about how to sing, or tells
Yeah.
us very little about how to breathe. Certain things like we give the soft palate way too much credence. The
Hmm.
soft palate can make sounds nasal, with nasal resonance, with oral resonance, or with a mixed nasality as in a French vowel. This idea of a lifted soft palate at all times is a misnomer. You can't sing in French
Hmm.
with a lifted soft palate.
Yeah. Well, and it also doesn't really lift very much.
It
That's
also
a
doesn't lift very
Yeah,
much.
it doesn't really move a whole lot, and a lot of times what people think they're doing when they lift it, so to speak, air quotes, is they're really just depressing their tongue and their larynx to make
Absolutely.
more space. So
Right, but
yeah,
we call that a
absolutely.
tall vowel, even though vowels are formed primarily by the tongue,
Yeah.
which can't be tall,
Yeah.
right? So we
Right.
we do these things in our choral culture and our choral language that not only doesn't explain the internal logic, actually makes us misunderstand
Yeah.
the logic of
Yep.
singing.
Yep. And then our talented kids will still get it to sound good anyway. And then the kids that really need the explicit instruction won't get it.
Right,
Hmm.
right,
Yep.
right.
And I think
And so
that's
they
where
won't continue. They don't become lifelong singers.
right.
Yeah.
Yes. They quit because they feel like they're bad at singing.
Hmm.
Yeah, that is. I think you and I are right on the same page with that, and its impact down the road. So this is really good. So I'll leave you with a final thought as we go out. What would be your hope that for the choral future where we do more research? Would that be your big thing? Like what or that we just are better at communicating the pedagogies that we are working with? What would be your prescription on the way out?
Yeah, so in the choral methods class that I just finished teaching for this semester, I worked with my students on the idea of when you make a lesson plan, what is the concept that you're teaching? I know you want to get through 30 measures of music. I know that you want to put this piece together. I know you want it to sound a certain way. While you're making this lesson plan, what's the concept? Is it theoretical? Is it vocal? Is it expressive? And then in order to learn that concept, usually we experience it first. So yes, we're great. Choral conductors are great at getting people to experience things, experience in tune singing, experience a gorgeous vowel. And then we usually represent it. We use a hand sign. We call it tall. We say it sounds more British or it feels like yearning, right? We give it a representation. And then oftentimes we leave it there. We don't connect it to a concept. So I would just say for educators, think about you're doing great things, right? We're all doing great things, especially on the experience side. But what concept did you teach when you taught today? When you worked on measures 75 to 95? And did you say it? Did you give it a label? If you asked your student what that label meant to demonstrate that label, could they do it?
Yep.
And that changes assessment, right? You can assess singing if you actually taught them something about it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because that's one of my biggest pet peeves is do your students even know what it is that they're trying to learn today? Or would they say, well, we have a concert next week, so we're just learning these songs.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we had a concert in 16 weeks.
Yeah.
So we learned these songs.
Yeah.
But what concept, when you're creating your lesson plan, even if it's just one, what concept are you teaching today?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Andrew, this has been really, really good. I appreciate you spending an hour with me, and I think we unpacked a lot of stuff today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
All right, great. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. One, use the promo code. That's the biggest one at Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choralosophy checkout code, and of course now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.